Welcome to the Movement Upgraded podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jen Hosler, licensed physical therapist and certified strength and mobility coach. Here you can expect to hear about all things movement. The Movement Upgraded podcast is a blend of the science of strength training, rehab, and mobility, mixed with the personal and professional experience to provide you with the steps you need to keep your body pain-free and moving well, so you can do what you love forever. All right, welcome to the Movement Upgraded podcast. We have another guest today. This is our first non-Movement Upgraded guest. I think we had Ryan on already. So I'm really excited to introduce Seth Goudreau. Welcome to the podcast, Steph.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I followed Steph a very long time ago. So she's been on a trajectory of things, but I followed you when you were Stupid Easy Paleo, like a very long time ago. I think that was it. So I was getting recipes from Steph a while ago, and then I've watched her kind of progress and become somebody who is now really working on helping women, I think, unlearn certain things that we learn in the fitness industry and help women have a lot of good, actionable, like science information that works for their bodies, because women are not the same as men. Sometimes we try to do the same things as men. It's not applicable to us. We have these things called cycles that affect things. And there's just a lot going on. And Steph specifically works with women in their 40s, which I really like because I see a lot of women in my clinic and I work a lot with women in that age group. And that's kind of where things start to show up that we kind of do all in our 20s and even into our 30s. So I am excited to have Steph here to talk about this stuff specifically, especially because I work a lot on the movement side. I'll work a little bit on strength training too, but Steph really does a good job at incorporating recovery and nutrition and strength training. And that's kind of like the whole thing of what she does. So I'm going to let you kind of start off with telling me, what are some of the things that you see in the fitness industry that become problems years down the road?
Oh, how long are we going to be here for? No. Wow. Okay. So from the nutrition side, I guess I'll answer this question, which, we can be a little bit, in some cases, more what I would say loose with ourselves when we're younger in terms of our nutrition. And I also want to be really mindful that there is also a lot of, for lack of a better term, orthorexic type content being pushed out in the world. TikTok is terrible for this, and other social media platforms, like really unhealthy perspectives on eating. And so I don't want to preface what I'm going to say with the idea that, we have to be really militant with what we eat and we have to be super restrictive and super perfect and clean. I do not believe that at all. And that causes more harm than good. But sometimes we pay a little bit less attention. We don't necessarily need to focus as much on, for example, our protein intake. And if you're eating, you're doing your thing, you're having your 2-3 meals a day and everything seems good, we don't always think about how that's going to impact us in terms of training. Maybe we're not noticing that our muscle is starting to slowly slide off our bodies, even if we are kind of getting into the gym. So we see that a lot, right? Is we're not being as mindful about protein intake. We're still probably getting it, but we're just not really trying to be strategic. The other issue I see a lot, of course, comes from the dieting influence and the dieting element. And many, many, many people, especially women, have experimented with diets from their teen years, and sadly, even earlier, have been put on diets. And so we get this perspective that we just need to eat less and move more. And that becomes the lens through which we view our nutrition and how we move our bodies going forward. And, that sentiment might work or might be appropriate for certain people. However, I see a lot of my students and my clients coming in to work with me where they really did that through their teens, 20s, into their 30s. And now they're really suffering from signs of things like low energy availability. And they put it down to things like, I'm just not very motivated, or wow, my training is not effective anymore, so I should just do things even harder. And they're oftentimes missing that element, that the low energy intake. And what I'm talking about by that is they're not eating enough to support our activity levels. We have these thought viruses that have been implanted in our brains, things like 1,200 calories a day. And, we should be skipping meals and that's okay. And wow, it's a lot to navigate, but we oftentimes will see that now we're not as resilient to stress as we're getting into our 40s. And I'm talking about even from a female hormone perspective, life events. And, now you're middle-aged. Congratulations, you're an adult and you've got to deal with work pressures and family issues and older family members who you might be caring for, or they're getting sick. And it's just a lot, finances and, now the pandemic. So there's a lot of stress. We're less resilient to that stress. It's starting to affect us more. We start to incur things like more injuries. Maybe we have disruption to our menstrual cycle. We have issues with performing in the gym. If everything feels like a slog, we're getting more sick more often. We're getting, taken down by colds and things like that. Our immune system is not quite where it needs to be. So this stuff isn't just affecting your ability to go into the gym and do your squat set and PR that day, but it really affects your overall health and well-being. And so those are, I think, two of the biggest things that I see that we maybe can get away with a little bit more when we're younger. And now, as we're getting into our 40s and beyond, it starts to really catch up with us in ways that we then wake up one day, and probably much like you see with clients, are like, this injury just happened. My shoulder just exploded. And it's like, well, you were probably getting the signs along the way that things were not ideal. And it was just that one loaded movement that kind of kicked everything off. I see similar things with people where they're like, well, yeah, my energy's been kind of lagging, and I'm not, like, it's way harder for me to build muscle than I thought. And what's going on? It didn't just occur overnight. The good news is there are really things that we can do that are pretty impactful if we start implementing them consistently. But sometimes we arrive at this, like the threshold of 40, feeling like, how did I get here? And it's really been kind of years, decades of some of these things that we thought we could tolerate, but now it's really starting to catch up.
I talk a lot to my clients about the ability to zoom in and zoom out accordingly. And so sometimes when something happens, we're so zoomed in on today and yesterday and last week, like right now, what happened, and your body, your metabolism, your like entire body systems are all a product of the past several years and decades of things that happen. And sometimes we're constantly like, I hear this a lot with metabolism, especially, and your metabolism is like the culmination of things you've been doing for a very long time. And so it's really important to realize that. And I work with a lot of women who've gone down that yo-yo dieting, and they're just like, they're chronically injured. That's usually why they end up in my office, because they have these nagging injuries. And so we'll start to talk about the things that you're talking about. And I'll go through these basic things. And sometimes it feels just like I'm teaching them how to be like an adult, taking care of an adult body, just like the basic things that we don't know are important. And I feel like part of it's because of the messaging for women with fitness is fat loss, weight loss, shrink, be smaller all the time, versus men get be strong, be powerful, nourish your body. And it's just like some of that's kind of the problem. And we can't always be constantly trying to lose like 5 or 10 pounds, which I feel like majority of women that I work with have been doing that for decades. They're like, I'm just trying to lose these past 10 pounds or something. And at some point, you can't be dieting forever. So when it comes to all of what we're talking about right now, what do you think are like the big 3 things that women can kind of work on or need to work on very consistently when they're dealing with all of these issues that you just explained?
Yeah, the biggest question I ask people to kind of get started, because sometimes the things we think are the most important and we should be focusing on are actually they're either things that will work themselves out if we address more foundational or fundamental things. And also the things that sometimes we focus on they're the easiest to buy a solution for. So I'll give you an example: supplements. Mm-hmm. Now, there are some supplements that can be really useful, especially, again, I'm talking about in the context of strength training, creatine, I'll just give out as one possible example of that, right? It's actually very hard to get enough creatine from dietary intake alone. So there are certain things that feel like an easier solution because I can go buy it and it's easy all I have to do is remember to take it, right? It seems much more accessible than having to address the foundational or fundamental reasons why. And the question I ask people is your eating chaotic? And the vast majority of my students will say yes. My eating habits are quite chaotic. I'm skipping a lot of meals. I don't have a system for having food on hand and prepped and ready to go. And that works for my life. Maybe I tried to do the whole 21 identical containers for the whole week of chicken and plain rice, and that didn't work very well. So they're lacking systems. They're lacking consistency and being able to implement things in ways that work for their schedules. So if your eating is chaotic, the answer is not to go out and buy the most expensive supplements that you can buy for performance in the gym. So I would start by asking that question. If you're like, no, I eat, I feed myself consistently. And you were talking about like basically reparenting, I'm reparenting myself here. Mm-hmm. If I am eating more consistently, then we can look at trying to get a little bit more granular with what you're doing. What are the contents of your plate on an average day? What are the macronutrients that you're getting? What is your meal timing like? But that's more advanced. Mm-hmm. And so when people ask me those questions on social media, again, I'm like, I don't know what you're doing. It's like, exactly how many grams of this and that should I eat post-workout? And I'm like, I could give you the answer to this question. It might actually help you, but I might be doing you a disservice because you're missing the foundations or fundamentals. So backing up to your question with that long preface, I would say, first of all, looking at not skipping meals. If you are someone who is like tucked into work, you're busy, you're focused on that. And you look up you pull your head up from the computer and look above the screen and it's 3:00 and all that you ate today was coffee in the breakfast, in the morning for breakfast. And maybe you had a nibble of something, some crackers or a protein bar or something like that. That is the place to begin, which is not skipping meals. This has such a knock-on effect for the people that I work with my students in terms of their performance and how they feel. And oftentimes leads to other things like those 4 or 5 o'clock sugar cravings that are popping up out of nowhere are actually because your body is trying to get you to take out some energy on board because you're in an energy deficit state. And one of the easiest things to digest and give you quick energy is carbohydrate.
Yeah. So of course you're going to crave that.
Like, so of course, then we make it, sugar cravings are bad. Then we go and we eat, half the pantry because we're just like ravenously hungry. And so then we're bad. And that kicks off the cycle of continued sort of shame and over exercising and some of the things that we see in a lot of our clients. So number one is stop skipping meals. And I know that's people are going to say, but how? This is how I live my life, which is where implementing this with the help of a coach or someone to help guide you can be really useful. The second thing I would say is start paying more attention to your protein intake. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So critical for so many different reasons. As we're starting to hit our 30s, we're losing muscle mass, period. End of story. Then we add into it that as women, we have the eventual loss of estrogen. That's going to be, we're going to experience up and downs throughout our perimenopausal period, or what I usually refer to as the menopause transition. Eventually that's going to fall away. And that has an impact on muscle mass too, because estrogen is very muscle sparing. It helps us to be more anabolic and build. And when we lose that in the grand scheme of things, now it's even harder. Estrogen also has this really cool impact in muscle tissue of essentially stimulating these satellite cells, which are like muscle stem cells. So again, as we are women, we are aging, we're starting to lose some of this signal. That's even harder to build. So we need a couple things in order to make this happen. If we want to keep our strength up and we want to sort of attenuate the loss of muscle tissue, we need enough protein intake. We cannot make this from nowhere. We need especially those essential amino acids, of which there are 9. And of those 9, the 3 that are the most important for muscle synthesis are those branched chain amino acids: leucine, isoleucine, and valine, or valine, depending on where you grew up in the country. And so we have those 3, and they are really, really critical. And again, we can get protein from a bunch of different places, but not all proteins are equal, which is why we sort of spend some time in education, like much like you do in talking about education of all of the things regarding mobility and movement. Not all protein is equal. And at the same time, there, again, another thought virus that takes hold very early on, because it gets repeated, is that the RDA for protein, that's the recommended daily allowance, is the optimal amount that we should all be topping out at. And that is not true. The RDA for protein is the amount that we need to prevent deficiency. And there's even some call now going on in the research to bump up the RDA.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be surprised. I feel like that's been way too low in general.
Way too low. So it's 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is very, very low. Now, the research, the body of evidence that we have about people who are active, exercising, trying to build some muscle and strength, in particular women, the range is more like 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight to 2.0. So I just said that the RDA is 0.8. Now for women trying to build strength and muscle mass, it's double that. So we have to think about how are we going to, and again, these numbers, you can kind of do the calculations and you can still be left with this information and go, how am I supposed to do this? And that's what coaches and folks help you do. But that is such a big one. So we want to spare muscle tissue. We want to be able to build muscle tissue, especially in the second half, the luteal cycle, if you're a bit younger. Because of the high hormone phase, we're actually more catabolic and we're breaking down more protein at this time. So getting an overall baseline of trying to eke your protein up a little bit, especially if you've been really low, is starting small. And, I usually do this with people. It's like slowly building up, right? But that this is a huge element. It also is really a very high satiety macronutrient. So it's going to help you stay fuller for longer. If you're somebody who kind of grazes and snacks throughout the day and you feel like you're eating a lot, but you're never satiated, that's another key.
I feel like that builds on the first thing that you're saying. If you cannot start to pay attention to protein until you are consistent with your meals, and then you're building on those habits. So this is kind of where it goes down to, like, it's not just this checklist of things you need, it's your habits and kind of how you set things up, which goes down to the coaching. And I just wanted to highlight what you were saying is that protein gets more important as you're active. Like you need more. And even if you're not a strength trainer, by the way, if you're a runner, there's actually some research to show that you need even more, because exercise does break down our bodies. Like the point of exercise is to stress your bodies, to give a stimulus to your body, to make adaptations to change. And your body's not going to just randomly be like, oh yeah, I just need to build stronger muscles. No, your body, like you go in the gym, you kind of destroy them a little bit. That's actually where the muscle soreness comes from, not hydrogen ions. It's literally like the muscle soreness comes from destroying your tissues a little bit. And if you're somebody who like feels like you're chronically injured and having some nagging injuries, like protein's actually a big thing that I start with my people, just saying, let's see where you're where you're at. And that just is something I wanted to highlight. Again, stress fractures is really important as well. And that can be a huge one that most people don't know. We don't correlate this nutrition thing. And I will go a little bit into that with my clients, but obviously I refer out as we need, because some people need all of the behavior changes and they need just kind of like an overhaul of how they approach nutrition, which is why I like so much of what you do. So,
Yeah, I was on my protein tangent. So
totally. I just wanted to stop for a second and go right into that, because like I loved what you were saying. It's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I could talk about that all day. So the last thing I would mention with protein, and this isn't as big of an element, but when we look at our total daily energy expenditure, we have several elements that comprise that. And the thermic effect of food is one of the elements of how our energy balance works. Our body is, taking in energy, we're using energy. And so protein, again, highest thermic effect of food, which means we're spending the most energy to actually break it down, assimilate it into our body, and essentially digest this protein that we're eating. So it has very many redeeming qualities. A lot of people are worried, oh, this is going to hurt my kidneys. And in healthy individuals with healthy kidney function, there is no evidence that would support that statement that protein is damaging to the kidneys. So
thank you for highlighting that. I was going to ask that.
That's been thoroughly debunked. And by the way, if people are curious and they're kind of research nerds, go and look up the International Society for Sports Nutrition. Mm-hmm. They have a protein position stand or paper all about this, incorporating tons and tons of different studies and looking at that. So, just also circling back to what you mentioned about stress fractures. Stress fractures, there's some sort of like, there was a study done, I should say, in 2016. It was done in New Zealand, and they looked at female recreational exercisers. They found that 45% of them were at risk for low energy availability, which means they weren't eating enough. And there was a statistically significant number of them who also had stress fractures. So again, low energy intake, not eating enough, et cetera. Is there a link potentially to that? I would say the third thing that I see with people, and this kind of goes back to where I talked about with skipping meals, but it's a little bit more of a specific case, is the idea that women and fasted training is really going to help us, when in fact, especially as we get older, we are already more sensitive to like an increase in stress and cortisol, simply because of the hormonal changes that we're experiencing. And this is one of the ones I hear a lot. Like, I used to do fasted training when I was in my 20s, potentially into my 30s. And all of a sudden I'm doing it in my 40s. And like, the supposed side benefits of this fasted training, like, I'm not experiencing those anymore. And actually it's kind of working against me. Specifically with regard to things like performance and energy levels, and also body composition. So I don't like to harp a lot on, things like scale weight, because that is not always the best indicator that things are changing in the direction that we want. So for example, if we're putting on more muscle mass, and it can bring up a lot of sensitive things with folks about their changing bodies. But I will say this much, is that as women, we already do a really good job of using free fatty acids because of our hormonal profile. And so whereas men sometimes see side benefits from doing that fasted training because they're trying to teach their bodies to use those free fatty acids, we don't actually need to really train our bodies to do that, because we're already pretty good at doing it naturally. And so then we start to see where not only does it have an impact on our performance, like we're feeling really sluggish, we can't hit those, when we're supposed to go and hit that intensity. Not that every workout should be an intensity 9 or 10, please, like, let's get out of that cycle. But when we're out there trying to really see improvements in our training, because we want to have the adaptation, when we can't hit the intensities that we need to, or the percentages that we need to, or it's supposed to be a heavy day, and every time we go in to do a quote unquote heavy lifting day, we're just like, not today, then we're not seeing the improvements in our training. We're not going to get the benefits. So it kind of works against us in that way. And it also keeps us at a higher risk for within day low energy availability, especially if that fasted training happens in the morning. We fasted all overnight. We wake up, we go into the gym, especially if we're doing high intensity. We get out of the gym, we're busy. Oh, work has to start. I'm on a Zoom call with my boss or whatever it is. Kids need off to school, etc. Now it's 2-3 o'clock. I've barely eaten anything all day. I haven't given my body the things it needs to actually recover from my workout, period. And now I'm at this big energy gap for the day. So I'm going to try to smush it all in this very small window. Now, there are some benefits for fasting. There are some benefits for certain populations. So I'm not going to say it's an invalid tool. but a lot of the purported benefits for fasting we get from exercise.
What? What?
Right.
No.
Like, sort of cellular cleanup and, insulin sensitivity and all of these sorts of things that were like, these are the benefits of fasting. There's not a lot of research with athletic female populations, especially in the premenstrual age, because we were considered at one point too difficult to study. And that's slowly changing, I think. But as of right now, the fasted training thing, if people are like, I feel like this is just something I want to try, I'm like, come talk to me in 3 to 6 months when stuff is not really going the way you thought it should go. And I've made this mistake, and I've seen it in so many clients, is that we think that one good strategy should be lumped onto all these others. So what I see a lot is women who are already go-getters, high stress, busy, are fasting, and they're oftentimes cutting their carbs really low, and they are they're trying to give it their intensity in training. They don't just love lifting, but they're also like, I love my Peloton, I love hiking, I love these things. And I'm like, I want you to be active and love your stuff. That's great, but you've got to give your body the fuel to recover, to avoid, again, these like low energy availability consequences and more serious things that can happen, and to just be able to enjoy yourself. So those are some of the biggest things. And so I see women stacking these things, thinking if one is good, then they're all going to stack up and be great. And then we start to see things like loss of the cycle, thyroid issues, mood and irritability, difficulty actually performing in the gym and kind of doing the things that you want to do. And it's just, I know it's really hard because people see that this is popular and it's works for these dude biohackers who
I was going to say, so I actually did this. This is me. You're describing me. I did this like my first year out of PT school, which was like 4.5 years ago now. And I hadn't been doing that towards the end because I was getting into the like biohacking and like, I love podcasts, and like, we have to remember that these are all men. They're men, like the men dominate the industry. And all of the men I was listening to were men, and they were having men on their podcast, and it was just men talking about it. And we can't extrapolate men's stuff to women, like you were saying. And I went down this whole path of doing that. I wasn't exercising super hard because I didn't have the time, because I was working like 50 plus hours in a PT clinic and then building all of this stuff on the side. So I was the high performing woman doing all this stuff, high stress, had no idea how to regulate my nervous system, which was also like something I had to learn. By month, I was like not eating. I would fast. Like I would do 24-hour fast, like 1 to 2 days a week. It was like, I don't think I ate a lot of carbs either. I don't remember how much I was eating, but I would often not eat till late, just also because, again, I was busy. So it was like, it worked with my schedule. And there was like all these purported benefits. And then by month 7, I crashed so hard. I got sick, more sick than I probably have ever gotten sick, besides the COVID and vaccination, which destroyed me. But like, those are the only 2 times I've been this sick. And I had a fever. I missed like 4 days of work. I had only 10 PTO days, and I had to use 4 or 5 of it just because I couldn't get off the couch. And after that, I don't know what I ended up having, but I had a 99-degree fever for 30 days after that. Like every day I had a migraine, and by the end of the day, and I had to work through it, and I just did what I could, but like, I didn't lift. I lost so much muscle mass. I started having a bunch of chronic pain stuff pop up. And so I'm sharing this, and this is like why I wanted to go down this, because I went down that path. It was not very fun at all. I was like, my emotional regulation was crap. Like I was depressed. I was like, whatever. I had a lot going on in my life because that was a really hard job, but like I was adding so much more onto that. And I think women don't realize that just because you're not starving all the time doesn't mean you're fueling yourself adequately. And that's something that I see. And then also, we don't necessarily correlate emotional dysregulation to a lack of food. And that's something I see. Do you see both of those things commonly when you work with people, or not as much?
Yes. I mean, there's an element of high cortisol, and some people feel like super focused and like they don't get hungry. And to your point, like that lack of hunger isn't always a good signal that we don't need to feed ourselves. And actually in people with high anxiety, on certain medications, and, even certain popular medications, they will have a decreased sensation of appetite, but that does not mean that it's okay to just not eat. And so this is one of the things that can get a little bit tricky, right? Also in women, you know, especially as we're kind of going through that menopause transition, the higher the cortisol, we're going to just be more apt to, again, storing fat instead of what we want to see or what we think is going to happen. So I see that a lot. My clients tell me all the time that they are way more like relaxed and nicer to their families. I've had that, you know, I had a client who was like, my husband said, like, you're so much nicer to be around. And, you know, we all have emotional ups and downs, and that's normal. But when you find that you're like constantly on edge, right? Your nervous system is constantly on edge. You, are having those like really extremes, or your lack of motivation. I see this a lot. I'm just not motivated. And I'm like, that's because, again, you're not supplying enough energy to actually take you through your day. So I see that a ton. And when I say, you know, I did this stuff too, I was training 5 times a week for competitive level CrossFit at one of the top gyms in San Diego. So I was doing that. Busy job. I was still teaching high school at the time. I was fasting. I was low carb, which was, again, a complete mismatch for what I was trying to do in my goals and what was appropriate for me at the time. And I actually hired a nutritionist at one point because I thought, why am I really struggling so much in the gym? My moods are all over the place. What is going on? I'm sore, overwhelmingly sore all the time. Like, what the heck is going on?
That's a big one. The constant DOMS is a huge one. Everybody's like, oh yeah, DOMS, I'm working hard. I'm sore. It's great. And I'm like, we need to stop using that. Like, I understand it, but like now it's like, should be looked at as, I'm sore. What is going on? Like, I'm actually pissed that I'm sore because it means I'm not recovered well. Usually for me, that's kind of how I look at it. But yes, that part.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I did a food journal for a week, and I like logged and counted everything because we needed a starting point. And he basically wrote me back and was like, I am shocked that you're not like laid out at this point, because my energy level was super, I was not taking in very much calories. My carb intake was way too low to support, especially the kind of lifting and high intensity training I was doing. And he was just like, like there's some stuff to do here. And at my job, I was spacing out. I was finding it so hard to focus on the kids and my students because I was always preoccupied. I was so hungry. And it was not great. And I did it for all the wrong reasons as well. I was like, this is going to help me get super lean. And that's a whole other
and sometimes
story.
It works, by the way. Like, I was super lean when I was doing that. I like, and it worked, but like, just because it's working now, like, what's the long term? And again, that like zooming in and zooming out thing, and just like, can we zoom out for a minute and think about Jen, like 20, 40 years from now? And is this setting me up for success in the future? And unfortunately, we don't always have that foresight, which I think is kind of why these podcasts exist, why I'm having you on here, is like, hey, I know there are people in their 20s and 30s listening to this. I also know there's going to be women older in their 40s who are like hitting this too, who are like, oh crap, that's me, which is kind of the whole point. But like, hindsight's easier, but like, really, are we doing something that's setting us up for long-term success or not? And I don't know if we had this, if we had access to this much information back in the day either. Like, I wouldn't say 4 years ago when I was doing this, it was definitely starting, but I think some of this is newer. But I definitely think like in the past several decades, like we've started to finally realize how much different things are for women than men. So my question for you is, where do you feel that, I'm trying to think of how I wanted to frame this question. Where do you feel, let's start with this. Do you feel like when you're trying to get women to eat more, which is something that is very what we're kind of talking about, do you feel like there's a lot of pushback by women to do that? Like, they're afraid, there's like still a fear, or are women just kind of so at their end, they're like, no, just kind of do what you think is best?
I think it's split.
Okay. Between
those two. I run into both. And I'm very, you know, some women that I work with are at the end of their rope, in terms of what they've tried. And they're thinking, you know, I'm honest with myself, and what I've tried before isn't really working now. And so I know I need something different. Let's hell yeah, let's go do this. And then others, yeah, it is hard. Like when, again, I think I want people to understand things from a very neutral place, right? And I understand it's not always neutral to talk about things like increasing your food intake. And I'm very sensitive to that. Trust me,
you have to be if you're on social media right now talking about it too.
I totally get it, but I'm a huge proponent of giving people the science, giving them the stuff that we really know is grounded in a lot. There's a lot of evidence about these sorts of things. And so I want people to understand, and I make them calculate what is for someone of your body size, your age, et cetera, what kind of energy intake along with your activity level is appropriate for someone like you. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not tweaking that needs to be done. And for example, if somebody's been very, very low food intake for a while, we don't always just add 1,000 calories to your day. Like that's not going to work. It's not going to be sustainable. You're going to be freaked out. Maybe you're excited. I don't know. Most of the women I work with are like, whoa, okay. Like, how do I do this? So yes. The way we go about it is slow and deliberate, and we go slow so that you can always pause if you want. But I do feel like that is a shift. And so I'm always trying to frame it in like, if we want to build muscle, you want to have that benefit. I hear a lot of people say, I want to look like I lift, and everybody's body's going to look a little bit different, but I want to look like I've added some muscle, and, I can see some shape coming through here, or make a bicep. And like, I like the way it looks. We have to fuel that. We can't just keep taking away. And so sometimes framing it in that way of like, I have these goals. I want to actually, add that muscle mass. I want to lift heavier than I could before. Then we have to kind of shift that mindset a little bit to building, and what do I need to give my body? And that can be a little bit of a helpful strategy. And also, just continually reminding people that we can go slow. And we usually start with the most, I would say, neutral macronutrient that people often, for most people, this is where we start is protein, because it's like, of all the things we just talked about. And that can be a bit of a calming thing as well, especially if people have come from a place where they're like, I'm a little bit afraid of carbs. And I mean, we've been through it all, right? Low fat is scary. Now carbs are scary. Now, it's just,
now your kidneys are going to erupt if you have too much protein. I've seen that too.
It's just a lot. But as we get older, we don't need less protein. We actually need more. There's some really interesting research that's been done on older adults. And for example, even just in the post-workout period of, how much protein is really necessary. And generally we say something like 20 to 40 grams as a range. And for older adults, there's some really compelling evidence that it's actually at the higher end of that range. So it's one of those things where, depending on the person, their background, and this is why, it's all like, it's as personalized as I can get it in a group setting, or if I'm working with my one-on-one clients, we take this information and then we say, well, how do we start approaching this mountain? We can't just run up it, because we're probably going to,
crash and burn at some
crash point. And burn. Right. So we're going to figure out, what is the route that we're going to take? What are the preparations that we need to have in place? Like, what is the
sustainable?
What is the gear we're going to take with us on this journey? And that can be really helpful in kind of easing people's minds a little bit and saying, I don't necessarily need to, again, when I talk about the range of protein that's for active athletic people, and people automatically, they'll do their calculation and they think, I have to jump to the highest end of the range like tomorrow. And I'm like, that's not going to, no. Like,
it's funny how we just like swing like a pendulum. And I'm like, we always, like 99% of the time, we want to be right in the middle, like, let's slowly pull ourselves back over there. And that's
totally,
that I see that a lot. Sometimes some of my clients, when I talk to them, because I will talk about protein to every single woman that I talk to, just because it's so prevalent and such a problem. And they'll be like, well, it's so hard for me to get that much protein. They're just
Yeah.
like, I just feel like I eat protein at every meal. Like they'll work on those things and then they'll be like, and then I'll say, okay, well, sometimes this is where supplementation can help
Yeah.
in like a protein shake, especially
Totally.
if you are active. Sometimes you're going to need it. And they're like, well, wait a minute. Aren't those like, isn't that like cheating? And I'm like, please tell me how fueling your body with enough is cheating. And so I think this goes back to the very beginning of what you're saying. There's so much like orthorexic type of content out there of like, everything should come from like natural like stuff. And we can't have protein supplementation. And do you feel like that is super common? And how do you usually respond when somebody says something like that?
Oh, it is super common. I don't hear as much that people think it's cheating, but I do think that there's been, again, there's kind of been this like backlash against things like that. And I will say this much. Sometimes if you're approaching this and you're like, okay, I know that my protein intake is really low, and what is the easiest thing for me to do? For a lot of people, it's just like, yes, I'm going to, the lowest barrier to entry is for me to get a thing of protein powder and use it after I train, after my workout, or maybe before. It just depends on your schedule, right? So add that scoop of protein powder, and you know what? Now you're up plus 20 to 25 grams of protein for your day. It took very little effort for that to happen. And then once people start to feel a little bit successful with making that change, sometimes we start looking at other things, right? It's like, yes, we'd like to see that a majority of your protein intake comes from quality sources and whole foods and et cetera, and not specifically just supplements. But also, yeah, there can be times for a lot of people when a well-placed protein powder is the thing that helps them get started and lowers the barrier to entry. And I will say, is protein powder superior to food in terms of its makeup? No, and it may be superior for you as a choice if you're actually going to use it to increase your protein intake and you were willing to do nothing else, or everything else seemed too overwhelming.
This is where like context always matters. And this is why I like the nuance that you do. And this is why I appreciate you. And I think that people kind of get caught up in certain things that they see other people doing. And there's this like idea of FOMO and like, do I need to be doing that? And sometimes I love social media for that because it gives us a lot of ideas and starts to create this awareness. And then other times I'm like, now everybody is so bombarded with information when there are things we need to prioritize. And what I keep hearing from you is like, there are big dials, there are small dials. Some of those change based on the person. But when you work with people, I know that you work specifically with women in their 40s who have kind of gone down this route of all of these things and kind of need to kind of learn how to prioritize them. Is there like a hierarchy that you typically help them learn, and like what's most important for when you're educating people in how to do these things?
Yeah. So I used a version of Eric Helms's muscle and strength pyramid, I believe it's called, which was then adapted by Girls Gone Strong. And I did their women's coaching specialist training. And so I've adapted a version of that for my program, which is I call it the priority pyramid, because when you don't know where to begin, like, let's just prioritize in this way. So the base of the pyramid, surprise, surprise, is foundational habits. Up from there, we go to energy balance. So making sure we're eating enough. From there, we go to meal composition. So this is where we can start being a little bit more fussy and sort of looking at the details of, for example, I want to make sure that your protein energy intake is high enough, not just your overall energy intake. We're going to focus on that first, but then we go up to protein energy and really looking at that. And then of course we have carbohydrate and fat energy. And from there we go to meal timing. And then from there we go to supplements. So this is sort of like the hierarchy that I'm helping people navigate. And a lot of times, some of the things that we think, oh, I need this like really obscure supplement for, even things like beta alanine, which is a really well-studied supplement, has some benefits for people. It's the supplement where if you take pre-workout powder, it makes your skin itch, which is just a side effect, very harmless. But people will say like, oh, beta alanine. And I'm like, tell me about your tell me about your breakfast routine or your, how you prep food. Or are you able to, chew slowly? Do you chew or do you actually eat a Chipotle burrito in 3 minutes? I mean, that could be why you're missing some of your fullness signals if you're concerned that you're overeating. So we look at some of that stuff first, and then we kind of go up from there. And throughout that, we're kind of looking at like, for example, how would we navigate that menopause transition with things like carbohydrates? And that goes into that meal composition category, because people are like, well, I heard I should be keto. And I'm like, if you're an athlete, you're an athletic woman, I don't care if you're competing or not, you're out there, you're doing all your stuff, and you're concerned about that. Yes, we can be more insulin resistant at this time because of how our hormones are shifting, and we have increased stress and so on and so forth. But also, it doesn't mean we have to get rid of every single carbohydrate in our lives. And if we're looking at things like slower digesting carbs, we're looking at things like more fruit and vegetable, more starchy veg, more whole grains, fewer highly processed, highly sugared, alcoholic carbohydrates. That's a wise choice to potentially make as you're approaching your 40s. Is like, can I just start to shift some of these things or make some other choices, and not villainize those foods either? Because that no
middle
good
ground,
no good ever comes from that.
Yes.
But also being honest and saying, yeah, as our bodies like don't use, like how we process things like the carbohydrates and what we eat changes a little bit. Yeah. Like, let's, instead of eating that donut, maybe I can have, I don't know, maybe a banana is a better choice, or an apple, or I don't know, like fill in the blank here, oatmeal. But people have been so led to believe that carbohydrates are so evil. And I asked the question, have you ever binge ate oatmeal or something? And they're like, no, that's just ridiculous. And I'm like, right, because on its own, it's a very boring, I'm using air quotes, a very boring carbohydrate.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's where we start to combine the highly, sweet and highly, refined fat, like we put those combinations together. Those are the foods that for a lot of people can be really hard to stop eating.
They're harder to stop eating when you restrict them and tell yourself they're off limits too. And they're
absolutely
bad food. So we add like another layer of like this thing, and you're going to think about this thing if you're never allowed to have that thing. That's like that kind of is a very common thing. So totally. Also, in conjunction with what you're talking about with this insulin resistance thing, what people fail to recognize sometimes is that other things besides your diet can affect your insulin.
Like stress.
Or what about sleep? Yep. How many people do you have to talk about sleep with them? Probably all of them.
Yeah. That's part of the, I have 4 keys that I teach in my program, and recovery is one of them. And sleep is a big part of recovery.
Yep.
Especially for athletic people, but for everyone.
Yep, exactly. So it's just like one of those things that there's multiple layers involved, and we sometimes just pick one thing and just run with it in the industry, or when you see things with people. And it's just super important to remember that like you're your own person. And as we're consuming information, which goes for everything, if you're listening to this, just because somebody else does it doesn't mean it's right for you. And it's really important to like know yourself. And if you don't know what you need or where your problems are, you can always get ideas from social media. But if you don't have like a strong center of knowing what things are important to focus on for you, it just might be beneficial to work with a coach to help highlight those things for you. So that's kind of where that always comes down, in my opinion, to understanding, because that's in my field of work as well. So with that being said, is there anything else that you feel that anybody in their 40s should be paying attention to a lot? Is there any last minute statements you wish that people could understand?
Yeah. I mean, I would say on the athletic, again, I'm talking to athletic populations a lot of times. And I used to be a cyclist. I was a competitive cyclist for many, many years. And we would go out for long rides at that kind of like moderately hard pace and so on and so forth, not doing sprint intervals, but also more than a walk or just a very slow spin, like you would do in recovery. And this is one of the areas where a lot of women who are athletic and maybe they've done sports or they've been a runner for a really long time, or they've been a cyclist for a really long time. They'll go out and try to do that like long mileage, many times a week. And they're like, this is not actually helping me progress. And so that's one of the areas where like looking at actually working more in high intensity or working in some intervals can be helpful. It's not to say you can't compete. You can absolutely compete. You can absolutely still go on your long runs and rides and all this stuff that you're doing. But sometimes we have to shift a little bit more bias toward a little bit more high intensity and a little bit less of the long, slow distance that you're used to. I'm always a big advocate for walking. So like, yes, go do your walks and get that in. But I'm talking about that again, kind of like moderately hard, you're out for a long time. And a lot of us learned to do that stuff when we were in our 20s and 30s was like the way to improve our cardiovascular fitness, and how we have to sometimes shift some of that stuff. And then the last thing I'll say is like lifting heavy enough so that you're actually getting the stimulus to build that sort of strength and then muscle. And those are two different categories, right? We're talking about hypertrophy versus strength, but I kind of lump everything together just so we talk about it in an easy way. But so often, and I maybe get in trouble for this, I am not knocking modalities of movement like yoga and Pilates and stretching and bar, and they all have their place. And if you want to do them and you enjoy them, and please just keep going and doing your thing, but also we can't pretend that those are strength training.
Nope. I've seen even, I want to say it was the CDC website. I've talked about this in one of my episodes. They have recommendations for 2 times a week for lifting. That's like, right. But under that, they say bands and some forms of yoga would be considered resistance training. And I've talked about this on my podcast prior, but those are everything that is resistance is going to be a starting point for some people. For some people, like it will be enough stimulus for them to build a little bit of muscle and progress, but it's not enough in the long run to really provide you with the adaptations you need to set yourself up with success in the future. I think that's what you're trying to say here.
100%. Yeah. There can be starting points and entry points there. And also those things can help you introduce variety to your routine. And like, yes. And I'm not against that at all. I just think that sometimes because we're maybe trying to do it on our own, or we don't know any better. Again, like if you're somebody who's not a trainer, or you've not gone through PT school, or you just haven't learned how to program, you're not going to necessarily know how to progress your workouts. And so, yes, everybody has that starting point. You may go back and use some of those things as useful things in your training, and they all have a place, but it's also not the same as being able to provide a heavy enough or a hard enough stimulus to your muscle. We need to be able to use all of our fiber types, especially since we tend to slide a little bit more into that type 1 fiber as we get older. We're losing our ability to move explosively, to, to produce a lot of force and power through that more, like type 2 type fiber. And so we need to maintain that. And how do we do that? Is we have to recruit those tissues, lifting. And again, I'm using air quotes heavy, but like something that you can do for 5 to 8 reps, that's really going to challenge you. And it's hard. And it's not, I don't want you to think you have to squat 300 pounds.
You don't even have to squat at all if you don't want to.
Yes,
like, this is something I'm adamant about. Like, I know. If you just wanted to lunge, cool. Just make sure the lunges are challenging enough for you.
Yes. I know. Yeah. And I really love what you talk about with, back squatting and things like that. And it's not going to be appropriate for everybody. And so I think, as long as what you're doing is challenging, and as long as we understand that, yes, we can see benefit from 30 reps of something if it's loaded appropriately, but also like, it's not necessarily the same as those more strength-based rep ranges. And of course there's bleed over and is more of a range. It's not an exact number, but like to see people trying to weave that stuff in, and you have to go with where you're at and slowly move up. And it's not something you're going to achieve in a week.
Years.
Yeah. We're talking about years of investment of that time in yourself and that energy, and sometimes working with someone to help you move past those sticking points. But that would be the other thing I would say is like, we need that stimulus to especially grow that muscle tissue as we're getting older
and challenge our bone density. I talk about this all the time, but you don't want to be the 90-year-olds that I saw that are rolling over in bed and breaking their hip. Like I've seen that before. And like, you can't prevent all of these things, but bone density is super important. The younger you are, the better of a chance you have, but it's never too late to start working on it.
100%. Yeah. And I think that's the other thing people sometimes think it's too late for me to impact this. And the research disagrees with you on that. Like you can make changes and have positive impact no matter when you begin.
Our bodies never stop adapting. This is something I tell people. So just because you're supposedly reach your peak, that's for people who've been training for decades and they are actually peaking. But if you haven't been, you didn't reach your peak in your 20s. Like you have a lot of opportunity ahead of you. So it's just, that's a very important point to note there. So I like that. Yeah. What I wanted to highlight real quick before we kind of finish off the podcast was the zones that you were talking about with cardio. This is something that I talk a lot about to my clients as well. And there's different zones like zone 1 through 5. If you have talked about that or familiar with those. And I talk a lot about zone 1 and 2 training, which is just walking at a distance where you can still nasal breathe and have a conversation, but like it's not challenging. Most people kind of really think about cardio in those zones 3 and 4, where they're just pushing it. So you're really pushing your, like how hard, so you feel like you're doing a workout, but then you're pushing it so hard that it's just this constant zone 3, zone 4 challenge. And you don't recover very well from that. And it's a really big challenge to the heart versus zone 1 and 2 is kind of like eccentric training for the heart. Somebody has said that to me and I really liked that. And I think most fitness people who are very like into cardio tend to stay in that really higher zone. And like Steph said, stay in your zone 1 and 2 with your walks or your low intensity cardio, and then do your thresholds if you want to push the fitness, but don't live in that middle zone because that's where we start to create some maladaptations from the heart that might not be super beneficial actually to your heart's muscle tissue. It adapts depending on what you're doing. And there's a science to strength. So the whole interval thing is helpful. So you make sure you're actually getting in and getting out of the intervals, recovering, and that gives you the ability. And then zone 2 really is just helping you, and zone 1, helping you build a bigger engine. So, and that's like really great for recovery. So I just wanted to highlight that what she's saying is very important to pay attention to before we gloss over that. So thanks for bringing that up.
Absolutely. And especially again, as we're older, we're women going through the menopause transition into menopause, like we are already, again, we're like less resilient to stress. We're more sensitive to that, we're running higher with cortisol as it is in a lot of cases. So we're just only adding to that if we're really insistent on that kind of like, we can kind of keep trucking, but it's not a high enough intensity, because if it's truly high intensity, you are not going for hours, like you're not going right, because you have to, it just is how that kind of training works. Right. So one of the things that I'm going to be weaving back in is like, I do a lot of jujitsu, right? Which is sort of that, like I spend a lot of time hanging out between, I would say 50 and 70% of my max heart rate. Occasionally I'm up in the 90%. So I'm doing a 2-minute interval there in that training session. I'm going to start weaving in one more set of probably Tabata in my week, and just to see what happens, right? Because now I'm 43. I like I said, I do a lot of walking. I live a lot in that sort of like 50 to 70%. It's not quite that 70 to 80% threshold, but I want to see what happens if I weave that in. And I think that's one big change. I think that the fear is like, I will lose fitness. I will lose my capacity. And my really good friend, Marissa Axel, is a cycling coach, and she works with women in their 40s. And this is one of the big changes I know she has them do, is start doing more interval training, which is like, it can be way more painful because it's hard, but it pays off big time when it comes to women's performance. And it's just not one of the things I think we associated a lot also with, again, like the world of CrossFit, and like a lot of people have negative connotations and experiences with some of those things. But as a practice, that high intensity training there's so much science behind this. Like
Yeah. And if you're fueling yourself and recovering adequately, like you're fine to do it and you're going to get benefits from it. It's the whole like other things that you were talking about that typically are when people become run into problems, or they think they're doing interval training and they're just doing that zone 3, zone 4 constant push that you were saying. Yeah. And so that's like the difference is if it's the higher zones, you cannot sustain that power output or that speed for very long. And then you have to recover. If it's a zone 1 or 2 workout, then you basically could redo that workout like 3 or 4 times and be fine. Like that's kind of the delineation between those. Like you were either chilling and getting some movement in and we're like enjoying it. We could probably do this all day, or we are destroyed. Like it is hard and we cannot continue for much longer. That's why they're intervals. So those are going to be your best places to go in fitness. We don't really want to live in that middle zone where you're just pushing it.
Yeah. Dr. Stacy Sims uses the term polarized training to describe that. So I'll attribute that to her. And I think that's great. That idea of like, I go hard and then I go easy. I go hard and then I go easy. And that's not something that we naturally gravitate toward because we think that fitness has to be this like constant, relatively high energy output slog. And we don't always want to go through, like if you've ever done a Tabata, and you've done it properly, it doesn't sound like a lot. 20 seconds of work, 10 seconds of rest, repeat that 8 times after you've warmed up and then cool down. Like
it's awful.
The first 2 or 3, you're like, I got this. And then you're like,
joke's on you.
Oh, this got really spicy. So like those are, total effort, 4 minutes.
Yep.
Doesn't sound like a lot, but wow.
It's crazy to understand that. I've been doing sprints recently for like 15 seconds, just like running as hard as I can, mostly because I was like, I wonder what this is like. And then I recover for like a minute and a half, 2 minutes minimum every time because I'm destroyed from running as hard as I can. And I physically couldn't continue. But it's really fun to kind of incorporate some of those. It makes you feel a little bit more athletic. And those have different training adaptations than your low intensity cardio. And the thing that I'll kind of wrap all of this up with is that exercise has different like purposes, and different types of exercise and different approaches are going to create different adaptations in your body. There's a science to understanding all of these. You don't necessarily need to understand every single little detail. Just know that like working hard doesn't necessarily mean you're getting what you want. And so there's different ways to approach lifting for strength versus just moving to move and feeling good versus like doing cardio for certain adaptations, like intervals where you're going to get a little bit of a different hormone response and different changes in like all of your, even your type muscle fibers that we're getting to. And then there's low zone cardio that's going to be different on your heart and all of your hormones. Like there's just difference for different purposes. So if you don't know the intention, the purpose, and like the why behind something, it may behoove you to, again, hire a coach or just do a little bit more learning to begin to understand those things so you can approach it in the best way so that it's actually doing the things that you want. Because the whole point of fitness and training is to get the changes out of your body that you need. So, do you have anything to add to that as we kind of wrap up this podcast?
I just think it's fascinating that, we're living in a time where we're learning a lot more. I mean, science is an imperfect process. It's always evolving and changing, but there are people out there sharing good quality information who are doing it from a perspective of, helping you achieve what you want instead of it being like, I have to beat myself up in order to make this happen, or this has to be really restrictive and terrible. And I think, follow the people out there who are sharing that quality information. And at some point, if you're continuing to butt up against the same challenges, like I was saying, but I think before we recorded, information is not the same as implementation. And sometimes you need quality information in order to get over a hump. And then sometimes you're like, I've been doing this or learning these things. And sometimes we also confuse like the process of learning. We think it's the same thing as implementing, and it's not always the same. They're related, but I think, it's okay to ask for help. I think social media has democratized this stuff in a lot of ways, like the sharing of information, like things that only used to probably be accessible to academics. Now we're like sharing PubMed links.
I know it's kind of cool, but it's also overwhelming.
It can be overwhelming. And at the same time, like we don't have to expect that if you don't have any training in this and you have like, you're not a nerd and it's not like something you really want to know the differences between, is like, there are people out there who make it their mission to help you. So, go out there and we can be doing strong and amazing things into our 40s and well beyond. I just saw an article about a woman who's 73 and riding her mountain bike in the Pacific Northwest, actually in Canada. And I was like, this is amazing.
Honestly, goals.
Yeah, totally. So 40s, it's not over. You may have to do some things differently. You may have to hire another person to help you weed through all of those things. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, you can want to be strong and challenge yourself and continue to live a life where you get to do the things you want to do. You're independent, you're enjoying yourself. And I think we used to celebrate 40s. I remember when my stepdad turned 40 and there was an over the hill party.
I remember that when I was younger with my parents too. And I was
Black
like
balloons and like a tombstone cake. And honestly, I think our generation is seeing that differently. And there's a different conversation around aging. There's a different conversation around menopause. There's a different conversation around being in your 40s or approaching that time in your life. And it's okay. We get to redefine that. And I think that's really exciting.
I love that so much. And I like what you said about finding people that you trust that are giving you good information. And if you're looking for a certain thing and they're telling you can't do it, you don't always have to take, or that you can only do it this way. Like, it's really important to just find the people who have the nuance that are kind of portraying that. Like, that's a very big sign that there's somebody you would want to follow. If there's somebody who are like very kind of adamant about like, this is the only way, it's like definitely like a good yellow flag. And the one thing I wanted to note about following people is that note what they are really good at, what they're educating you about, ask them, consume their content, pay them for their information. But be really careful about what other things you're asking from them, because this is something I see in the fitness industry a ton. Just because somebody is a coach and they're good at strength training doesn't mean they're going to be able to rehab you. And I keep seeing it's because that you trust them, right? You trust them to give you information about everything, but you should really only trust them for the information that they're experts in. And if they give ideas or talk about what they're doing, that's one thing, but really note where you're getting your information from and make sure that it's not like, I trust this one influencer or this one person on Instagram for everything, because not everybody can be everything. And that's why Steph does a really good job at bringing experts on her podcast. I'm starting that. We're brand new, but we're trying to do that. And so we are definitely facilitating that a little bit, but make sure that you are also doing your own diligence of, okay, is this a question this person that should be asked? Or, do I need to be making sure that I ask somebody who's actually in that field? Because I know you get that question a lot. So with all that being said, this was such a phenomenal podcast. There's so much good information in here. So thank you so much for coming on here. I know that a lot of women are going to really enjoy this podcast. I just can already hear some of the responses from it, because they're going to be like, this is so helpful. So tell me where people can find you and how they can work with you if they feel like this is something that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm most active right now on Instagram at Steph_Gaudreau, and my website, stephgaudreau.com, has information about how you can work with me in my program, which is called Strength Nutrition Unlocked. And this is really kind of my flagship program for helping women in their 40s and beyond to navigate this stuff and to walk away with strategy that actually you can implement and start seeing the changes and results that you want to see with your energy and building muscle and improving your strength. So that's that. You can also find me at the Fuel Your Strength podcast, and that's on all major podcast apps. And yeah, pretty much everywhere online that you can possibly search my name. I'm usually there, but those are the places that I'm most active.
Perfect. Awesome. Seth Goudreau. I said that wrong when we intro.
That's
so I'm just going to tell everybody that I said it wrong. Seth Goudreau. Got it. Okay. So that is where you can find Steph. If you want to consume more of her information from her big, beautiful, very smart brain, that is where you can find her. I definitely recommend it. Thank you again so much for being on the podcast. And I appreciate you so much.
Thank you.